not just to control, but to continually direct the lives in terms of where the world is going of billions of people. So today I'm going to talk about Trump, progressives, Zionist billionaires, fake news, and the state of the alternative media. And all those things are part of a coherent whole when you see how the dots connect. Now, Donald Trump, he was elected not because of what he is and not because of what he'll do, but because of a public perception, at least among a great number of Americans, a public perception of what he is and what he will do. And, well, reality is dawning already. He's gone back on prosecuting Hillary Clinton for extraordinary levels of criminal activity and corruption and much more. He's going back on climate change being a hoax. He's condemned the so-called alt-right media that essentially got him elected. And he's going back on his Muslim ban. And he is apparently going to produce an economic package. Sits back in amazement, can't believe it, struggling with a shock, that will benefit the very rich and make them very much richer. He really has only one area left already. I mean, he's not even in office yet, where he can produce what he said he would do. And that is not to appoint heads of defense and Secretary of State from a pool of people apparently being considered that are warmongering, let's go to war with Russia, let's continue business as usual in terms of overseas imposition of American will through military means. We can only hope that he will be, even him, though it must take something, that even him will be too embarrassed to appoint those sort of people to the Defense Department and the State Department after what he has said about improving relations with Russia and not wanting to have the regime change of President Assad in Syria as a non-negotiable must be, which is fundamental to bringing an end to that US, UK, NATO members manipulated catastrophe, which is masquerading as a people's revolution in Syria. And interesting that Trump has already spoken out against the so-called alt-right. And you know, will people never learn? What politicians do, and con men and liars, sorry I repeat myself, is they tell their electorate that which they have to get to vote for them, that part of society that will vote for them, never mind the ones that won't. They have to tell that potential support what it wants to hear. And if Trump was going to get elected, he had to get this increasingly vast number of people, massively increasing number of people, who get their information overwhelmingly through what's become known as the alternative media. People who are sick of being lied to by the mainstream, decade after decade after decade. And so what Trump did is told them what they wanted to hear. So it was a climate change hoax, it was going for the economic system and sorting out the Federal Reserve and all these things that people in the alternative media want to hear. But now, of course, reality is dawning because he's going back on one after the other. And if he goes back, we hope he won't. We hope he will be too embarrassed to do it. But if he goes back on his pledges for foreign policy and puts war hawks in the key positions, then there is, before he comes to power, there is nothing left, basically, of what he said he would do. And it's a head shaker for me that significant swathes of the so-called alternative media in the United States should be supporting Trump in the belief that he was going to do what they wanted him to do. And, of course, all we're seeing is a repeat of what happened with Obama and the other side of this ludicrous political so-called spectrum. He came in, he was going to be the great new political messiah of change and transformation. He wasn't going to be like George Bush before him. He wasn't going to be a warmonger. He was going to be about fairness and justice and all these things. And, of course, you would take it as a gimme that the first black president would be good for black people in America. Didn't work out so well, did it? The why is simple. He was just the first black frontman president for a hidden hand cabal that had used, up to this point, white men, frontmen in the White House. So it was business as usual. But there was a difference, you see, and this is very, very significant in this psychological game that is going on, because it's all a mind game. Remember during the Bush administration when he was using the excuse of the completely internally created 9/11 to justify going into Iraq, etc. There was a very strong anti-war movement started to build in the United States. And it was made up of what people are now calling and call themselves progressives. I'll get to that later on. Then Obama comes in, the darling, the messiah of the progressives, and continues business as usual with what's happened in Libya, for instance, what's happened in Syria, and the extraordinary levels of death and destruction that his policies, in league not least with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, have visited upon the so deeply tragic Middle East. Where's been the anti-war movement in the Obama years? Where is it? Nowhere. Why? Because when you put your faith in this Messiah president, this Mr. Progressive president, then, a number of things happen. first of all, you can't, or you don't want to admit to yourself you've been had, and thus what you would condemn Bush for, rightly before, you keep your mouth shut in terms of Obama, even though he's doing the same things. And so what we're seeing now is the same, but at the other polarity. We're having the so-called alt-right and those parts of the alternative media that supported Trump already privately, and even some, to be fair, publicly, aghast at the way he's going back on everything. So fast as well, I mean. Anyway, but some are now already defending him for going back on what he said he would do. Why they're defending him? For the same reason that the progressives went quiet and the anti-war movement went quiet once Obama came in, doing the same things that Bush had done. And alt-right. This is this new phrase for the alternative right-wing media, as opposed to the mainstream right-wing media. But, you know, I started out doing what I do now. Basically, before there was an alternative media, there was literally nothing there. The odd radio station here and there. And you had to get this information out through books or by tramping around from place to place, talking to next to nobody, because nobody was really interested in those days. It wasn't an alternative media. And it's worth, and I think it's important now, for the alternative media, or calls itself that, to actually take a breath in the light of current events and just reevaluate what it's there for and why it came into existence in the first place. Because if you identify with a political position, whether it's right or left, whether it's Republican or Democrat, whether it's Labour or Conservative, or any other these political polarities anywhere in the world, then from where I'm sitting, you are not part of the alternative media. You are just mainstream light, if that in some cases now. The alternative media came into existence originally to point out that the whole right, centre, left political paradigm is a gigantic hoax. It's a hoax because in the shadows, all these different apparently alternative political persuasions are actually masks on the same face of a force in the shadows. And that's why, whether it's a left government or a right government, essentially the same things happen and the world goes in the same direction. It was to point out that the system is rigged and you will never change anything through the political system, because the political system is actually there and structured to stop anything changing for the better of the people, to stop anything changing that stops this incessant direction of the world to global fascism from continuing. So there is no such thing as an alt-right, an alternative media that calls itself right. Just as there's no such thing as a alternative media that calls itself left or centre or progressive or any of it. Because these are all tags and names and labels for basically the same thing in terms of ultimately what's controlling them. And So the alternative media needs to look at itself. The genuine alternative media that is exposing the way things work rather than taking political positions within the structure of the way things work. And it needs to make sure that it doesn't get pulled into this political nonsense that significant parts of the alternative media have been pulled into. Then there's this thing coming up now more and more and more in the last few days since the Trump election, and it's called fake news. Well, the ironies are not lost. This is the idea that Trump got elected because of fake news from alternative sources on the internet, social media, and all this stuff. The irony, there are many, but one of the major ones is that the mainstream media is pushing this about fake news, as are the politicians, of course. If you want the home of fake news, decade after decade after decade, then just go to the alternative media. The mainstream media. Although the alternative is involved in fake news as well, as I'll come to in parts of it. If you look at even the leaked emails in terms of Clinton and the way the media was working with her to her benefit and to manipulate the perceptions of the population, for that same media now to come out and start saying we must, in effect, start censoring the internet because of fake news, it's extraordinary. But of course, the genuine alternative media has and continues to make a fantastic contribution to the circulation of information and exposure of the system and that which serves the system in all its forms, which is making an impact upon the political system and on people's awareness of the world as it really is. And so, of course, they want to label things in a way that targets the alternative media. So it's all fake news. No, it's not. Actually, it's the best journalism on planet Earth comes from the alternative media. However, as I said, with a little, what do they call them, Freudian slips, when I said alternative instead of mainstream, that actually was very relevant, because it's no good either, the alternative media sticking its nose in the air and looking down on the mainstream, and then having very significant swathes of it operating and acting in the same way the mainstream does. Let's not fall into this black and white trap that the mainstream media is fake news, but the alternative media, all of it, no, it's the truth. No, it's not. There's a load of old bollocks comes out through what calls itself the alternative media. We have websites, many websites that call themselves alternative media platforms that blatantly put out fake news that they've made up. You have a situation where they put out a headline designed to make you click on it so that you'll add to their advertising revenue. And when you go to the text, having now added to their advertising, the text in absolutely no way justifies the headline. It's called clickbait. That's alternative. There's one website, actually, again, ironically, run by a former webmaster of davidicke.com some time ago, that not only operates with the clickbait technique, but actually uses a named writer that doesn't actually exist. And they call themselves alternative. Now, if you want to discredit the genuine alternative media that's making and has made such a fantastic contribution to the population's awareness of what's happening and it's not being told about, then all you do is you pick out the fake news people. You pick out the clickbaiters. You pick out people who are using fake writers. And you say that's the alternative media. It's not. But that's the way propaganda works. So it's important that the genuine alternative media doesn't sit around and just let this go unchallenged, but constantly highlights to people where these clickbait sites are, where these fake news sites are. And the alternative media cleans up its own house. And please, those that have supported Trump in the alternative media and taken a political position, please sit down, take a deep breath and have another look at it. It's about the system, exposing the rigged system, which means it doesn't really matter who comes in terms of front people, because the system's in control, whoever's there. That's what we were created to expose. Now, progressives. These are people, it's a word used in America, it's being used in Britain and more widely now. Progressives are those, you can pretty much recognize them because they have big hearts all the way down their arm, on their sleeve. I'm so kind and I'm so good. Look at me. Look at what I'm doing. I'm such a kind, loving person. Right. Let's see. One of the words that is put together with progressive, almost like they're interchangeable terms, is liberal. In fact, in America, it's conservative or it's liberal. It's Republican or Democrat. So this word liberal is thrown around all the time. In fact, it's thrown around very liberally. So, three definitions. Liberal, favouring reform, open to new ideas and tolerant of the ideas and behaviour of others, not bound by traditional thinking, broad-minded. Well, I mean, that's pretty much the direction I'm coming from. If you want to use the dictionary definition, now progressive, which is supposed to be liberal, but isn't. Much of it anyway. Progressive, favouring or advocating progress, but who decides what's progress? Change, improvement, who decides what's improvement? And reform, as opposed to wishing to maintain things as they are, especially in political matters. Well, there's nothing in that definition that you could call liberal. It's just wanting change, etc. Now, this is interesting. This is the definition of fascism. A tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. Now, when I look at the behaviour of so many people that call themselves progressives, it's that last definition that I see. We have people, well, it's obviously much of it has been generated and coordinated out of the shadows, but we've had these protests against Trump that he shouldn't be president, that things should happen to stop that happening. We've had violence on the streets. These people call themselves progressives. Yet if Clinton had have won, in the same way that Trump did, that would have been to these same people. The people have spoken. It's democracy. Instead, we've had these progressives holding up love Trump's hate banners with fury and hatred on their faces. I mean, anyone got a mirror? Might be helpful. These people are so self-deluded. They don't see that their behavior mirrors that which they claim to oppose. And so we're having these protests, and then we're having Clinton supporters, progressives, crying and in need of therapy and stuff because a woman who so believes in the rights of women that she takes millions from the royal family of Saudi Arabia, which you may have noticed has a problem with women's rights, but someone who is one of the most deeply, deeply corrupt people ever to appear in American politics, and my God, think of the competition, has not won the presidency of the United States. Therapy! Instead of looking at what is wrong and what is behind a system called democracy and politics that offers you a disaster or a catastrophe in terms of Clinton or Trump. And look at some of the people, one of the major people that fund these progressive organizations. George Soros, Zionist oligarch billionaire. Who was someone that put tens of millions into the Vote for Trump campaign? Sheldon Adelson, Zionist oligarch, billionaire. Does anyone really think, in their terminal naivety, that those two people don't ultimately answer to the same masters? So why would you have massive funding of progressive movements and massive funding supporting someone the progressives demonize, Trump, for president? We come back to where we started. Divide and rule. George Soros and his Open Society foundations and all the networks that go out from them was majorly involved in triggering the Arab Spring, which was presented by the fake news media as a spontaneous people's revolution in the Arab world. It was just a front to allow Western, not least American and British, funded, armed, trained rebels, mercenaries, to start a proxy war by America and the UK and other NATO countries against targets in the Middle East like Gaddafi and Assad. But they said, oh no, it's a people's revolution. It's just a front for a proxy war. Because if you keep invading countries over and over again, openly, like in Iraq, then people are going to go, what's going on? So you sell it as a people's revolution. And quite a few months ago now, there was something in Washington, D.C. called Democracy Spring, where progressives went to Washington to protest about billionaires and their influence in politics, as if their poster boy Barack Obama wasn't funded massively to record-breaking degrees at the time by the same people. And another irony, a number of the organizations that took part in Democracy Spring are funded by George Soros, a Zionist oligarch, billionaire, who does Springs rather well, it seems. What you have is people of a certain persuasion say the right. They get their information from the right-wing press and what's become known as the alt-right. And then you get people of a progressive persuasion, and they get their information from the left-wing press, or the so-called liberal press, or the progressive press. And just as in politics and political parties, left, right, centre, whoops, controlled by the same people, so are the left-wing press and so are the right-wing press. They're just different masks, once again, on the same face. So all these groups within politics, whether it's the right or progressives or centre, they're all getting their information about the world basically from the same sources. And the only literal alternative to that is going to the genuine alternative media that's dismantling the system in people's minds by exposing what it is and not taking a left-right position within the system of control. And that's why they're targeting the genuine alternative media now through these fake news, anything but alternative websites, and through those who've taken a political position in the Trump election. And there's something that's a term that's come to be used more and more now. It's called identity politics. And it's time for all persuasions in the political spectrum and those in the alternative media that are not, in my view, very alternative, to grow up and to stop playing this identity political game that's allowing the few to dictate to the many, incessantly, ongoing. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'm gay, okay, I'm gay, not me, but I'm talking about this gay identity. There's lots of gay people who are not like this, but there is a gay mentality that looks at politics from a gay perspective. What about gays? Because their identity is that they're gay. Then you have transgender identity politics, which is all under this progressive wing. And then you have Jewish, Muslim, Christian identity politics, which says I'm this is my label, so I'm going to vote from a position that best suits my identity. It's the politics of me. Identity politics. First of all, that is a godsend to anyone who wants to divide and rule. But it also means that simple things like what is fair, what is just, what is right by all people, just go missing. Questions like that. What is the fair thing to do here? Not what is the best thing to do for my identity and my identity politics. What is the fair thing to do here in this situation? What is the just thing to do in this situation? And there's another part of this identity politics, which is money. What's the fair thing to do? What's the just thing to do in terms of the financial system? It's that no one is without a home, no one is hungry, and no one is allowed to fall below a certain basic level of life. But what does identity politics do in terms of the finance? It says, which one will make me more money than I already have, and I have more than I could spend in 100 lifetimes. All this identity stuff, all this me, what's in it for me, what will they do for me, has made us lose perspective of those simple things, those simple foundations of making judgments and introducing changes. What is fair? What is just? For all people concerned. And, you know, when I talk about progressives of the left, there are still some genuine people there that do come from that perspective and do value things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Because when we come back to this definition of fascism, liberal and progressive, but particularly when we come back to this definition of fascism, that's what political correctness is. It's the arrogant belief that you can dictate what people can say, even eventually what they can think, because you're right, and therefore anyone who has a different opinion must be wrong. There's no such thing as a different opinion to a progressive of this extreme nature, because they're right. Therefore, you've got a different opinion, you must be wrong, and because you've got a different opinion and you're wrong, what value is there in allowing you to speak? It's fascism. It's manipulation of the population, the target population, to silence itself, so those manipulating the target population don't have to. And the great drivers of this politically correct fascism, this destruction and deletion of basic freedom of thought, freedom of speech and expression, the so-called progressives. Oh, I'm so kind, look at me. All it is George Orwell's 1984 Newspeak. All those decades ago, he predicted this. And here's the progressives who are actually behind it. They're behind the hoax of global warming. So no one can have another view exposing that, otherwise they have to be silenced. And you know, progressives of this kind, and my God, they're growing. Do you know who put Trump in power? Eh? You did. You know who won the Brexit vote that you didn't want to go the way it did? You did. Do you know what's driving people into parties that are against immigration in Europe of the scale that's happening? You are. And I'll tell you why. Because you are the new establishment, the new authority, you have made it impossible, increasingly impossible anyway, not quite, try it with me, for people to express how they feel. If what happened with Trump, as I said in a recent video cast, it was a primal scream for help from vast numbers of people who knew Clinton was business as usual, and they just hoped that maybe Trump wasn't. It's a vain hope, but that's where they were coming from. And you know why? Because they have not had a voice. They've not been able to express what's happening to them economically, what's happening to their families, what's happening to their communities. Because you, progressives, won't even let them articulate themselves. Why? Because you don't debate anymore, because you've got nothing to debate with. You are vacuous in your evidence that you put forward to support what you're imposing on everyone else. Instead of debate, what we have are abuse and slogans. You vote for Trump, you are by definition a racist, you're homophobic, you're anti-transgender. What, everybody? If you vote to come out of the fascist, communist, bureaucratic dictatorship called the European Union, you are racist, homophobic, anti-transgender. This is what's gone on, and if you're concerned about vast numbers of people coming from the Middle East and North Africa and changing the nature of your community, you cannot speak out about that. Why? Because you are racist. Oh, and I bet if you're racist, you're also homophobic and anti-transgender. This is the fascist dictatorship of the so-called progressives that has led to where we are now. And you, ironically, are out on the streets protesting about it through organizations funded by George Soros, protesting about what you have created. So I say to thee, still genuine people of what is called the left, people who are genuinely liberal, you have to, if we're going to change this, take the meaning of what you stand for back from these fascist progressives and dictators who daily serve the very system they say they oppose. I'll say this to the genuine alternative media, and there are many in that, where the best journalism on the planet goes on currently. We need to take back what the alternative media really means and what it was created for. Not to take political positions within the system that we're exposing. And certainly not to put out clickbait headlines that add to the advertising revenue and produce stories written by named writers who don't exist. We can't look the other way for that stuff anymore. And perhaps, as the truth dawns about Donald Trump, increasingly fast to his supporters, and even now, I'm sure, former supporters, some of them, we need to go to the next stage of this awakening. You know, Brexit, voting for the perception of what people thought Trump was, is evidence that more and more people are sick and tired of being dictated to by this system of control. But we need to go to the next stage of this awakening and realize that the political system is not the way to do it. Ceasing en masse to cooperate with our own enslavement is the way to do it, outside the political nonsense and irrelevance in the governments of the world. Because whether you are left or whether you are right, Barack Obama and Donald Trump are not messiahs of change. They are simply different divides in the same rule.